Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our third and final day of our 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. We hope you found the last 2 days of this virtual camping trip valuable, as we've certainly covered a lot of third-party risk management material. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you're not familiar with our webinars or have not been on any of the bootcamp days so far, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. We keep track of all questions throughout each session, so you'll hear us answer some live, but those that we can't get to right away, we will address with you via email. Before we get started, let's recap a bit. On day 1, we covered inherent risk versus residual vendor risk and strategies for vendor due diligence. Then yesterday, on day 2, we talked about critical vendors and fourth parties within your vendor contracts, supply chain risk mitigation with third-party risk management, and business continuity, understanding vendor data breaches, and vendor SOC reports, as well as complementary user entity controls. That brings us to today, the third and final day of the bootcamp, where we'll start with an emerging topic, the new interagency guidance on third-party relationships, risk management, and the impact on your third-party risk management program. Then, vendor financial health in today's business climate. After that, we'll take a brief break. After our break, we'll cover the importance of vendor performance management and wrap up with metrics and reporting. Before we get started today, in the related content widget, you will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which has hundreds of educational resources, and links to several specific resources that we feel will be helpful if you'd like to learn more about certain topics discussed today. Underneath this slide area and next to the related content widget is a graphic showing the third-party risk management lifecycle. This will be helpful to reference throughout today's sessions to understand at what points these topics fit into the overall third-party risk management process. Today's live session is eligible for up to 2 CPE credits, 1 per hour. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during each session's presentations. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded on Friday, September 22nd, that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. For the next hour, VinMinder's Hillary Dewhurst, Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will discuss interagency guidance on third-party relationships, risk management, and the impact on your third-party risk management program. After that, Raman Zachariah, VinMinder's Chief Financial Officer, will join us to discuss vendor financial health in today's business climate. The regulatory update Hillary will cover is relevant to the entire third-party risk management process. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, because there are so many of you that are interested in this new interagency guidance that was issued back in June, we are going to go through it very briefly. We're going to talk about why it's important to all industries and give you some suggestions so that you can achieve compliance. So let's jump right in. Well, after almost 2 years, the interagency third-party guidance was finalized back in June of this year. And just as a reminder, the guidance is interagency guidance, which means the OCC, the FDIC, and the Fed decided it was time to harmonize and align their requirements and come up with one set of requirements for banks and financial institutions of any size. In theory, this harmonization is meant to drive consistency and promote better practices within the industry. Now, as a brief background, if you were familiar with previous versions of the guidance, you will be able to recognize that it mirrors the OCC's guidance from 2013, which was the most comprehensive and most prescriptive. If you were previously working under those rules, it shouldn't feel like that much has changed. But if you're a smaller bank or community bank, the upgrade to this more comprehensive structure could feel a little overwhelming. Now, even if you aren't in the financial services industry, this guidance does matter, and I'll tell you why. In 2013, when the OCC first released their guidance, it was considered the gold standard. And remember, financial regulators have really been the primary drivers behind formalized rules and requirements for third-party risk management. This interagency guidance prescribes a risk-based approach that follows the third-party risk management lifecycle, which is fundamental to effective third-party risk management no matter what industry you're in. And even if you're not in financial service industry, just following this guidance or being aware of its requirements can help ensure that your program is really meeting the highest standards. So there are two big questions about the guidance. The first one is, does it matter how big the bank is? What are the different requirements for, say, that mega national bank versus the community bank? And the basic answer is there is no difference. That's not to say that the agencies have not recognized there might be certain challenges for smaller and community banks, and they've pledged to provide additional resources and support documents in the near future to help those smaller organizations understand and achieve compliance. However, that has not happened as of yet. The next big question is who or what is in scope. Now, this is really important because this is the big change. Every business arrangement and every business relationship, excluding your customers, is in scope for this guidance, period. Now, what this means is that we are talking about third-party risk management in the most fulsome terms possible. It's no longer just about vendors or suppliers or service providers, but now it includes everything, such as your fintech partnerships, affiliates, joint ventures, marketing agreements, revenue sharing, etc. Now, again, this is driving a lot of anxiety for a lot of folks, but don't worry, because we are going to cover some practical and tactical actions that you can take to address this expanded scope. And while you think about that, it's time for our poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, my organization is regulated by the OCC, FDIC, or FED. Has customers regulated by the OCC, FDIC, or FED? Both of the above, none of the above, or you're not sure. Hillary, we have some time now to answer one of the questions that has come in from the audience so far.
Perfect. Let's do it.
And this question is, I know the guidance became effective on June 6th, but isn't there any kind of grace period for compliance, especially since they expanded the scope?
Well, the short answer is no. The guidance, once it was issued, became effective immediately. Some of the rationale behind that is that the proposed guidance was available for almost 2 years before it became effective. So the regulators are more or less assuming that you were getting up to speed during that time. I would say that some of the requirements, as they are broader now, they do include more third-party relationships or all of your third-party relationships. It's important to document a plan to get to compliance. So if you had a regulatory examiner come in and they see that you're not completely compliant, at least they'll see your plan to get there and how much progress you've made. That's probably the best advice I can give you at this point.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on in the related content widget, please be aware we've provided our 7 takeaways from the final Interagency Third-Party Risk Management Guidance ebook for you to download. Back to you, Hillary.
So very quickly, we are going to point out some highlights of the guidance. Now, if you're worrying about what some of the expectations are, it's really important to start with the life cycle. And one of the most important things we can do is plan for that relationship, because this is the stuff that's going to help us not only identify how we need to manage that relationship throughout its lifetime, but also how much attention we need to put on it, what kind of policy it's going to fall under, how much reliance or assistance we're going to need to assess the risk associated with those relationships, and determining if it aligns with our strategic goals and objectives. So here are 7 key takeaways from that guidance. 1, not all relationships require the same level of risk management. Remember, there is no one-size-fits-all method for managing all third-party risk, and not all relationships require the same level or kind of oversight. The guidance is flexible and it's risk-based, and it can be adjusted to the unique circumstances of each third-party relationship. The next thing is you have to identify any critical third-party relationships. And the characteristics of a critical third-party relationship or activity include those that could cause your organization to face significant risk if that third party fails to meet expectations, can impact your customers, or have a significant impact on banking organizations' financial condition or operations. It's up to each organization to identify the critical activities and the third parties that support them. Number 3, due diligence is expected. Remember, the more critical or high risk a relationship is, the more due diligence is required. Your due diligence must be relevant to the risk presented by the product or service and the nature of that relationship. Keep in mind that the agencies have acknowledged that sometimes it's not that easy to get the desired information, and so instead you could look for alternative information to help you assess a third party, even if that means going to an external resource. You can implement additional controls or increase your monitoring, and you can even consider using a different third party. It's really important, however, that when you do have due diligence limitations, that your organization understand, document those risks, and do everything they can to address them. The regulators have also said that using external third parties for supplemental due diligence is acceptable, but it doesn't absolve your bank of your legal obligation to manage the relationship. It also said that collaborative efforts with other organizations and engaging with third parties to supplement third-party risk management can actually be beneficial and reduce the burden, especially for those smaller organizations. But it makes sure that you understand that the guidance still emphasizes that no matter where you get your information, you're still responsible for managing that third-party relationship safely and soundly. Number 4, don't neglect your ongoing monitoring. In truth, your organization can set the schedule. It can be periodic or ongoing, but keep in mind those high-risk and criticals need more thorough and more frequent monitoring. Keep in mind, over the lifetime of a third-party relationship, risk can change. There could be new or evolving risks or even decreasing risk. So it's important to periodically reassess and readdress the risks within the relationship. Ongoing monitoring typically involves reviewing reports about the performance and risk management controls, but it also means actually meeting with third parties regularly to discuss their performance and operation. It also means testing your internal controls for managing those risks for third parties, especially high risk or critical. And depending on the risk, the banking organization might also test a third party's controls directly. Number 5, The board of directors is accountable for third-party risk management. So the board of directors is responsible for the oversight of third-party risk management, and they set the guidance on the acceptable risk appetite. They should be approving policies and ensure that appropriate procedures and practices are in place. They need to consider how well those third-party relationships are managed according to their strategy and risk appetite, and that they are in compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. They also need to make sure that the bank is giving periodic updates on its third-party relationships, including planning, due diligence, contract negotiation, and monitoring, and whether or not management has taken action to resolve significant deterioration in performance, including monitoring and independent reviews, and if they've successfully dealt with any changing risk. So senior management is responsible for developing and implementing third-party risk management policies, procedures, and practices that are within the bank's risk appetite and the level of risk. They have a lot of responsibilities, but just to name a few, making sure that the organizational structures and staffing are appropriate to support third-party risk management, making sure that the relationships are managed with an appropriate system of internal controls, assessing whether the bank has access to data and information from its third parties, notifying the board of any significant issues, and even terminating business arrangements when they don't meet expectations or align with the bank's goals or objectives. Number 6, independent third-party reviews are essential. We need to make sure that the organizations are conducting regular independent reviews to make sure everything is working as it should, including how well third-party risks are identified, measured, monitored, and controlled. If the banking organization's processes and controls actually work, if the banking organization has the right staffing and expertise to manage all the risk, and this includes all the additional stakeholders and SMEs when necessary, and avoiding or removing conflicts of interest when choosing or managing third parties. These independent reviews can help an organization justify its policies, reporting, resources, and controls. And as soon as issues or concerns are identified, management has to respond promptly, thoroughly, and escalate them to the board. Number 7, documentation and reporting. We are going to cover this in the last session today, but just as a summary, it's really important to have good documentation and reporting, including that inventory of all your third-party relationships and, as appropriate, any subcontractors. And that inventory must clearly identify those activities and engagements that are critical or high risk. We need third-party risk planning and risk assessments, results and recommendations of due diligence, our contracts, reviews of quality and sustainability of the third party's controls. We need risk and performance management reports. We need to track customer complaints and any event posing a material risk to the organization, such as a service interruption, security breach, or other incidents reported by third parties. We need to retain the results of those independent reviews and periodic reporting to the board. So because we're talking about regulators today, it's important to understand what the supervisory focus is related to this new interagency guidance. And it's really basically common sense. We need to understand that the management is capable of supervising and handling the third-party relationships with the organization, and that they understand the impact of those relationships on the risk profile and the financial and operational performance of the bank, and that there's transaction testing or reviewing results of testing to evaluate those activities performed by the third party and to assess compliance with applicable laws and regulations. A couple things that regulators always look for: documented policies that clearly spell out requirements, processes that are in line with those policies, consistency in process execution, right? We do it all the time. Stakeholder awareness and compliance, and evidence that processes are being followed and that requirements are met, including risk assessments, due diligence, and monitoring. Now, with that, it's time for our next poll.
Our second poll question of the day is, has the third-party risk management function at your organization undergone an independent review, an audit, or regulatory exam in the last 24 months? Yes, no, we have one currently in progress, or you are unsure. Hillary, I have another question here that we can answer.
Okay.
And this question is, we are just starting our third-party risk management program and already have an audit scheduled. What should we do?
Oh, okay. Well, it would seem a little premature to have an audit scheduled right at the beginning of your program, but we can't always control these things. So what I would advise in this case is, one, to draft a memo to your management just explaining exactly where you are in the process. If you have a detailed plan about implementing your program, I would include that. I would then ask them to communicate with the auditor or the examiner regarding the status. In some cases, they may choose to delay that audit or exam because it is very costly and time-consuming to conduct these. And if there's just not a lot to look at, it may not be the best use of everyone's time. But if they want to go ahead with the audit or exam, make sure you have all your plans documented. Make sure you have good progress reports that show where you're going, some of the milestone dates that you want to hit as far as implementing, say, your policy or bringing your system up to date. These are all important components in being transparent to those auditors and examiners, just to let them know exactly where you're at. And don't be surprised if you do come away from that audit or exam with some findings or suggestions for improvement. But if you can try and delay it, that would be my first choice. If not, make sure all your ducks are in a row and be very transparent about where you are.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention back to the related content widget, where you will find our What to Do with Vendor Due Diligence Information ebook. As the new guidance discusses vendor due diligence, we thought you may find this resource helpful. I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
All right, so now that you understand some of the requirements, it's really important to reiterate that the guidance has not added new requirements, but it has expanded its scope. So how do we move forward? Well, the first thing is we need that comprehensive third-party relationship inventory. We need to identify the types, the vendor owners, and any policy that might govern that particular relationship. Because this is a lot of extra work, we have to determine if the third-party risk management team is going to need additional resources or support to make sure this all happens. Maybe that's temporarily or on a permanent basis. We need to perform risk assessments and determine criticality for every relationship and every engagement that has not been previously rated. And we need to think about the tools we use. Do our existing vendor due diligence questionnaires and document requirements sufficiently capture or can give us the right information about some of these new relationship types and the risks that might be there? With that, we need to understand if we have the right subject matter experts available. If not, we may need to access some external expertise. We also need to think about how we're going to educate all these folks that have not had to go through the third-party risk management process before, how to communicate, get them on board, and make sure they're compliant. And we need to update to our senior management and the board. We need to let them know about any new high-risk or critical relationships and the progress that we're making towards meeting compliance. So to wrap up this session, the first thing you need to do is read that interagency guidance. Make sure you understand it, especially if you're in the financial industry. Go ahead and perform a self-audit to see where the gaps are in your program against the requirements. And collaborate with your risk committee and compliance department to make sure that you have the right visibility of the new guidance, because we are probably going to need more than one voice on this to make sure everyone is on the same page and we're all working towards compliance. Start with building out that inventory. Leverage your existing tools wherever possible, but also consider how existing processes and tools may need updating to accommodate new third-party types. Consider how other policies may govern due diligence or monitoring processes. For example, if we're adding contractors to that list, then they'll be probably governed under our HR policy, not our third-party risk management policy. Ask for additional resources when necessary. There's a lot of extra work here, and it's going to take probably more than just your third-party risk management team to get it all done. And then make sure to keep your management and the board updated. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for our next session.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary, for that informative session. Now I would like to introduce Raman Zachariah, VinMinder's Chief Financial Officer, who will discuss financial health in today's business climate. Financial health monitoring occurs in both the onboarding and ongoing stages of the third-party risk management lifecycle. Raman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse, and hey, everybody. Today's agenda will focus on 4 key points, and we'll walk you through each of them in the next few slides. We'll want to understand why financial health is more relevant today than ever. We'll want to discuss which key financial documents and information you'll want to pursue and review, how to get that information from your vendors, including those private vendors, and then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's jump right in. So before we jump in, it's important to understand why proactive due diligence is important, especially for financial health. So we live in a very complex and evolving environment, and performing financial health reviews can ultimately expose what a vendor's financial position is, which could ultimately prevent downstream risks from occurring in other vectors that my colleagues talked about throughout this boot camp in the realm of cybersecurity and other areas across your third-party risk management program. So it's always good to review these vendors on a regular cadence, because new information is always present, and ultimately that new information could present new insight into a vendor's risk posture, especially from a financial health point of view. So regular checkpoints and a regular cadence is important, especially on those most critical vendors. And then having some sort of internal controls in place at your organization can be very helpful to allow you to take the next step to either cancel the contract or not renew a contract with a high-risk vendor, or ultimately perform additional due diligence to mitigate any sort of risk signals you find from a financial health point of view. So how should financial health assessments fit within situations in your third-party risk management program? So in-depth and regular financial reviews should be done on all of your critical and moderate critical vendors, but you should also extend a different form of review, specifically monitoring on a larger part of your vendor universe, so you better understand the risks that may lie across the tails of your large or expansive vendor base, or even if you have a small vendor base. You should consider some sort of monitoring, as I've mentioned on the prior page, for these less critical vendors, and then ultimately also put your high and moderately critical vendors on these regular monitoring slots as well, so you better understand and get alerted to any sort of changes in information and changes in risk posture. Ultimately, it's also good to have a regularly reviewed policy and appetite as it pertains to your risk appetite and your vendor criticality levels. So in an environment where, like this year, where we've even seen banks go under, it's important to have a refresh and renewed perspective on all of your internal vendor relationships to best understand where there may be risk where historically there wasn't. So I often get the question on where to start when performing financial health reviews. So let's just jump right into that. If financial health reviews are new to you, welcome. This is going to hopefully simplify it and provide you some perspective on how to get started. Getting started can be as simple as adding a questionnaire for key financial information on your vendors and getting that information prior to your contract and onboarding with that specific group of vendors. And it can also be as complex and as daunting as implementing deep dive assessments and thorough due diligence reviews, as well as implementing systems and tools that help you monitor these vendors and look at their financial viability and their financial health posture. As mentioned, being proactive with your vendors, specific as it pertains to their financial health, is very critical and can ultimately help prevent the domino effect, which ultimately means that financial health could lead to other downstream impacts on your risk profile and your organization's posture and operations if the vendor is no longer viable from a financial point of view. So if you can get ahead of that domino effect and work to prevent it, you can ultimately either find new vendors for the same services or similar services and products, or ultimately work to mitigate the risks with different internal controls and actions your organization can take. This is a very cross-collaborative workflow within your organization, so you'll want to involve a variety of different people and ultimately work to avoid business disruption and operational issues across your organization, and be able to report to your board of directors and the proper examining boards if you're under that regulatory guidance as well. So I mentioned the domino effect, and it's always great to pull up this little image to show you the downstream impact that issues in financial health can put across your organization. So whenever you do a financial review, you may determine some key trends that are negative in nature, such as, say, declining revenue or declining profitability. If that vendor ultimately has those types of trends, that may mean and may lead to cost cuts that they have to make across the organization, which means cutting staff, which means declining service levels, and declining service levels leads to issues to you and other customers that are contracted with this vendor. So when I say try to get ahead of the domino effect, this image helps depict how these downstream risks can become relevant if you start to see and notice during your financial reviews risk signals in a poor financial health posture. So always keep this image and idea in mind when you're performing your due diligence reviews, specifically as it pertains to the financial health posture of a lot of the vendors you work with. So where should you start to avoid the domino effect with your vendors? It's important to prioritize the reviews and the limited time you may have for some of those key vendors. So again, focus on your critical, moderately critical vendors first, and then broaden the universe thereafter with the limited time and capacity and bandwidth you have. You also want to define a regular cadence. So annually should be the bare minimum, but if you want to perform more regular reviews, you can do it on a quarterly or even monthly basis with a subset of those critical or moderately critical vendors, or even higher risk signal vendors. You'll want to start with basic information like creating questionnaires and templates and due diligence request lists to get the financial information that's necessary for your reviews. And then ultimately support that process with a defined and identified methodology on how to perform the reviews and what key information you need, as well as a risk rating scale. And if you are subject to regulations or an examining board, don't wait for their guidance to perform these reviews. There's a lot of interagency guidance that points to performing financial condition reviews, but you should be proactive and not wait for evolving guidance or further direction. Risk exists everywhere, and getting ahead again to prevent that domino effect should be always something you should strive to do as an organization. So as part of our annual third-party risk management white papers, we ask a variety of questions of our clients and prospects, and ultimately 30% of them have come back with and said that vendors' financial health risk profiles are the most relevant or are an emerging area that they want to focus a specific time on their third-party risk management workflows on. So about a third of the respondents of this white paper ultimately point to vendor financial health being a critical area. And to reiterate that, it's important to get everything centralized and have a system, tools, and processes in place to ultimately help make this as seamless and as easy as possible, so you get a good understanding and you also have an audit trail and key workflows in place to mitigate the risks that may exist within your vendor base. So having all of these can provide you with necessary internal controls and can help ultimately organize your efforts in a way that allows for cross-collaboration and identification of key risks where they may sit across a vendor's risk profile. So having something centralized and documented should be another takeaway from today's session. So keep this in mind, along with some of your colleagues that also replied to our white paper questions this past year. So jumping into some of the key financial documents and details you should collect on vendors, I'm going to split it up into quantitative and qualitative items to make it easy for you to better understand. From a quantitative point of view, the numbers and the data, you'll want to get an income statement, a balance sheet, cash flow statement at a minimum, and want to get it for at least 2 to 3 years as it's available from vendors. These should be preferably audited or reviewed financials from a reputable third party versus internally prepared, because they tend to have more rigor if an organization, if they come with that level of assurance and guidance from an independent third party. You want to combine these data points from a quantitative factor with a lot of qualitative data points, such as management discussion and analysis notes from the vendor and the vendor's management team, any sort of audit opinion or going concern letter if they are audited or reviewed, and then any sort of supporting details as it pertains to their liabilities and debts, their legal and litigation exposure, any sort of ownership tables or sources of capital and funding, and any sort of relationships with their customers or suppliers, so you can identify if there's any sort of concentration risk within the financial information and financial posture of that vendor. Once you receive this qualitative and quantitative information, you'll want to perform some calculations, and some of those calculations are in these key ratios that we've identified here to help point out red flags and key concerns that you can use within your due diligence workflows for financial health. These are not exhaustive by any means, so keep these in mind and always consider others that fit your risk posture and other subject matter expertise you want to implement within your internal financial health reviews. Some that you should always consider are current ratio, which is current assets divided by current liabilities, and others that ultimately point to the profitability, like margins on gross profit and operating income, to better understand how profitable and how much liquidity a vendor has to support their operations and be a going concern to you and other customers they are servicing. So just keep these in mind. Again, they're not fully exhaustive, but definitely can help get you started in your reviews. So we often get a question on how you get information from vendors as it pertains to their financial health. For public vendors, it's quite easy. There's a lot of public information for ones that are listed on stock exchanges, either in the US or abroad. You can go to their website directly to get these filings, or even go to the Securities Exchange Commission website to pull down their quarterly and annual filings. You can always also interact directly with those public vendors as well, and they'll usually provide things to you. On the private side, it's a mixed bag on what's available, and ultimately you'll have to use your workflows and your outreach to get this information more regularly. You can also hold calls with them, and if those calls don't result in any sort of information being shared, you can rely as a last resort on other publicly available data sources like Dun & Bradstreet, Argos Risk, as well as some other public websites to get some sort of information at a high level on these vendors and their financial and credit risk profile. On that latter piece, the private vendors, there's always a challenge of getting adequate information from them. So we often also get the question of what you can do in lieu of getting information directly from them. It starts with being upfront with the vendor prior to contracting. So if you can insert any sort of language or SLA requirements that they have to provide you regular annual information and documentation, that's always a great place to start. Without that, you can ultimately just use your common workflows and outreach to them directly during the contract process or the contract period you have with them. And if they don't provide you any sort of information, they should have an IRS filing such as a Form 1120 that they provide to the IRS if they're a US-based entity or a tax-paying entity. So at a minimum, you should try to request that if they do not provide you any sort of internally prepared financials or audited financials and that may be sufficient when working directly with these private vendors. When all of those fail, you can request something even simpler, like a financial health letter. Typically, that's from someone like myself, a CFO of the company, and they'll talk about different trends, their revenue, their customers, their customer concentration, and other key factors. And that can give you at least a snapshot of how they're performing from a financial health point of view. And if that fails, as I mentioned, you can use publicly available sources or a source like Dun & Bradstreet or Argos to ultimately give you a picture or an idea of their credit profile and operational profile. You can combine that with some key pointed questions like, what is your revenue range? What is your liquidity and cash balance range? And do you have sufficient capital to sustain operations for the next 15 months, which would be a going concern? These ultimately help point you in the direction to get the bare minimum to better understand whether or not this vendor is viable from a financial health point of view to support your organization over the contractual period they've committed to. So when you're performing your financial due diligence, financial health reviews, you want to focus on the overall 360-degree picture and not just the performance metrics, either from a qualitative and quantitative point of view. The trends are important, but you'll want to combine those trends and financial details with qualitative factors and ultimately arrive at risk ratings that are consistent with your organizational definitions of risk appetite and points of view from a due diligence perspective. If the risk levels are manageable based on your reviews of the corresponding information, monitor that vendor on a regular basis, especially if it's critical or moderately critical to your organization, and move on to the next vendor or workflow in your third-party risk management program. If the risk levels are too high or there's a signal, you should trigger some workflows directly with the vendor, or if they're not mitigated and you've identified that there is no mitigation being put into place or new information from the vendor, you can ultimately look to cancel or not renew that agreement and work with a new vendor for a competing product or service with better risk signals and risk postures for your organization's risk appetite. So it's always useful to put the context on why it's important to review a combination of qualitative and quantitative information. So these two examples shown here really tell the story. The first vendor example, when you looked at the quantitative metrics or the financial performance only, you would notice no real risk signals. They're actually very healthy from a quantitative point of view and had very strong trends from a financial performance point of view. However, when you dug into the footnotes and the management discussion analysis, you noted that they had an exposure to a legal issue that totaled over $250 million. If you were to just look at the financials, you would have missed that litigation exposure because that's not displayed anywhere in the financial tables. So it's always good to combine the qualitative factors on top of the quantitative factors to get a better, full, comprehensive view of their risk profile. In the second real-life example, you see the converse. You saw a vendor that has a declining financial performance profile across all metrics, both revenue and profitability metrics, but you saw that they had improvement in liquidity on their balance sheet. So while the income statement shows deteriorating performance, the balance sheet notes something differently. So when you dig in a bit further, you'll see that the vendor improved their liquidity posture because they were able to divest core assets and restructure their business, which is typically a mixed signal, but ultimately can help provide more focus for the vendor to be able to service customers such as yourself. So again, the takeaway here is it's always good to combine quantitative and qualitative comprehensive views to get a good understanding of the vendor's posture. In conjunction with that, it's always good to look at these items as it pertains to the footnotes. So keep these lists in mind. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but things like subsequent events, going concern opinions, litigation and legal issues, as well as other items listed here can extend the review and make it more comprehensive for you and your team. To reiterate, here are some key steps you can do to provide additional context for the number. You can look at those risk factors by the vendor. They will tell you what the risks are, so you should understand them from that point of view. You should look for any sort of legal and litigation proceedings and lawsuits, And then if they're audited, you should review the audit opinion and the third party's opinion on the financials and the internal control posture for the vendor. So all these are great first steps to add to the qualitative information in your reviews. So before we go into the poll question, one last area to talk about. At a minimum, you should look at vendors on an annual basis and perform annual financial reviews. Don't assume that the financial health of the vendor today will remain the same, so always request new information when it's available over time. And then make sure that you maintain that regular cadence and perform regular monitoring on the vendor to identify and be alerted to new risk changes. You should also consider the following areas. So changes in scale, availability, and data depth, and performance trends are all things that should be informative of the risk posture of the vendor and ultimately where you land at when performing these reviews. So we'll now hop over to the poll question today, and I'll turn it over to Jesse. Jesse?
Our third poll question of the day is, does your current program have regular financial due diligence or assessments and vendor financial monitoring in place? Yes, only regular financial assessments. Yes, only vendor financial monitoring. Yes, both regular financial assessments and vendor financial monitoring, or you currently do not perform any of the above. Raman, I have a question here from the audience that we could go ahead and answer. And that question is, how often should we perform financial assessments and monitoring on vendors?
Thanks, Jesse, and thank you all for listening in and tuning in today, as well as for your question. On an annual basis, you should do your financial due diligence reviews at a minimum. I think it's a good cadence to kind of keep in mind, and also it's good hygiene from an organizational perspective to get requested documents constantly refreshed on an annual basis. When you actually dig into your vendor base, you'll probably want to classify vendors by different criticality levels. Others will be lower on the list or lower on the totem pole in terms of priority. Others will be more critical to your business and operations. So keep in mind that if you're performing annual reviews, you'll always want to go back and, depending on the risk ratings, perhaps do a more regular review, like a quarterly or even a monthly review if there's a higher critical or more important vendor for your operation. So again, to summarize, on an annual basis at a minimum, but depending on your risk ratings when you perform your reviews and perform your ongoing monitoring on these vendors from a financial health point of view and their criticality level, you'll ultimately be able to adjust to do it more frequently, either on a quarterly or monthly basis as necessary. So back over to you, Jesse.
And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. By the way, in the related content widget, you will find our 3 vendor financial statements to review infographic. This resource walks you through what to review in a vendor's income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Raman.
Thank you, folks, and thank you, Jesse. So to sum up, here are some key red flags to look for in 2023 and beyond when you're performing vendor financial reviews. You should always look for declining trends in revenue, profitability, and volume, or cash flow and liquidity issues. You should look for any sort of lowered debt ratings and bond ratings, any sort of recent adverse media or news releases or PR from the vendor, any sort of breach of financial and debt covenants, and any sort of notation around increased customer or supplier churn as it pertains to the qualitative information that supports the quantitative information from the vendors when you're performing these reviews. Once you get a good handle of those red flags, you should ultimately take a step back and ask yourself a few of these questions. Again, these are not all exhaustive, but help provide you some insight into what you can be doing from a financial health review perspective. First, you should ask the question, is the vendor's financials better than other providers if you're looking at a new group or a new vendor to onboard? Have we begun to see that domino effect we talked about a bit earlier? How quickly are we getting to a decision, and who can provide a similar service or product if this is an existing vendor you have a relationship with? And are my assessments or reviews from a financial health point of view combining qualitative information and looking beyond the numbers? These are all example questions you should ask yourself when you take a step back and ultimately look and assess your own financial health review process internally. So to sum up, here are some key takeaways of today's quick session. You'll want to perform financial reviews as often as possible, especially in that vetting and onboarding phase. And then ultimately, as you move to contract with the vendor, you want to monitor them on an ongoing basis of that vendor lifecycle. You also want to make sure to avoid the domino effect and don't let it surprise you, because that could lead to downstream risks that impact your organization's operational profile. And ultimately, you'll want to make sure to do these on a regular basis and be as thorough and solid as possible. You want to combine and centralize the information so that has a full audit trail. And then you also want to make sure to combine the information from a quantitative and qualitative point of view. So keeping all of these things in mind helps to provide you enough information to avoid that domino effect and hopefully help mature your third-party risk management programs as it pertains to financial health review. So thank you all for today, and thank you for joining us on another productive boot camp. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of the session and look forward to answering your questions later today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Raman, for the informative session. Before we move on to our next session, where Jill Sherman will discuss the importance of vendor performance management, we are going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move into our next session, the importance of vendor performance management, that will be presented by Jill Sherman, VinMinder's third-party risk principal. Monitoring vendor performance occurs in the ongoing stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle. Jill, the floor is now yours.
The agenda consists of 4 points: what to measure in third-party risk management, understanding metric types, uses, and identifying the right metrics to report, what should be included in reporting, and reporting to stakeholders. Vendor performance is essential. If your organization isn't managing its vendors' performance, then it isn't managing risk. Truth is, we engage vendors for a reason. They're supposed to help us fix a problem or realize an opportunity. Vendor performance management is the key to making sure that those vendors are helping you meet your organization's strategic goals. For example, if I engage a vendor to take over an inefficient process, I need to know that using this new vendor is more efficient than performing that activity in-house, and that improving efficiency helps us reach more potential customers, thereby yielding more revenue. What happens when efficiency is strong but the output is low quality? Or what if the vendor is pretty efficient, but that really doesn't help us meet more customers? In either case, the organization would need to reevaluate the approach. When it comes to performance management, it's necessary to verify that the vendor is providing products and services as we expect them to, with the right level of quality based on the agreed upon price. We need to constantly confirm that the benefit to our organization outweighs the risks posed by the relationship. Here are 3 reasons to manage vendor performance. Vendor risk is constantly changing. A vendor's performance is often reflective of both internal and external risks. Whether you're dealing with a vendor's management changes, declining quality, or ineffective security controls, active performance management will help you identify small issues before they snowball into very large ones. Remember, your vendors are supposed to deliver value in the relationship. From a strategic standpoint, when vendor performance isn't monitored or managed, there's no clear way to establish that the benefits of the relationship are being realized. Additionally, proactive performance management produces real data to help your organization decide whether to renew, renegotiate, or terminate a vendor's contract. And lastly, vendor performance data can benefit organizations desiring to consolidate their vendor lists or to drive more volume to a single vendor for obtaining better pricing. Faced with the choice between 2 vendors with similar products and services, pricing and delivery, the higher performing vendor ultimately delivers more value to the organization. So everyone wants to just jump right in with metrics and SLAs, but good performance management starts before you even ink the contract. It truly begins with how a vendor is going to support your organizational goals. So if we keep in mind that every organization has organizational goals, then here are some examples. Now, you can see that it says improve customer satisfaction, increasing market share, expanding geographic footprint, cross-selling more products, and reducing operating costs. Now, keep in mind that no one vendor is going to help you meet all of these goals. However, you should be able to articulate how that vendor contributes or supports to your organization towards meeting those goals. That understanding and articulation is really the foundation of excellent vendor performance management.
We are to the first poll question after the break. And this poll question is, does your organization incorporate SLAs into its contracts or amend them to contain SLAs depending on the product or service? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. Still, while we wait for the results to tabulate, we can answer a question from the audience. And this question is, should all vendors go through the same steps of offboarding?
Thank you, Jesse. That's a great question. And the answer is yes. All of your vendors in your inventory should be part of the same offboarding process. That ensures that the process is thorough, it's comprehensive, it's methodical or systematic, and that you're not forgetting anything, particularly when you're trying to terminate a vendor. because people often have stress due to time constraints, as well as there could be sensitivities on either side because you're moving out of a contract situation. So it's best to ensure a smooth offboarding process by going through the same steps for every vendor and making sure that you reduce any amount of inefficiencies, of any frustration when you're getting out of this contract, and you're also making sure that there aren't any breaches or loss of company time, and also ensuring that you're in good stead in the community. So if you were to ever engage with this vendor again, you want to ensure that your company has a good reputation within the marketplace.
Thanks, everyone. Here are those results. As a reminder, in the related content widget, you will find our 3 ways to measure vendor performance infographic available for download. As we've discussed so far, measuring vendor performance is an important activity that helps protect your organization's reputation and ensures any issues are identified and addressed quickly. This infographic can help. Back to you, Jill.
4 key components of performance management include established and agreed upon service level agreements and key performance indicators. These are both agreed upon measures that identify what the vendor is responsible for, and they derive from our contract and industry standards. Both parties must agree that which is measured and must agree upon which conditions will incur penalties for missed performance. Performance data collection and reporting. These are, again, measurements of performance that can be accessed for data relevant to that performance. And there should be no surprises here. Both parties should be able to access and review the data. Performance review meetings, those should be performed on a regular cadence. And keep in mind that we need to always be prepared to show such details to an auditor or examiner at some point. So make sure you keep evidence of regular performance management review meetings that are formal. And finally, issue management with time-bound tracking and closure. Issue remediation should be taken seriously. Issues that are past due or at risk of not meeting the scheduled remediation dates should be escalated to senior management. Vendor performance metrics and scorecards. When it comes to vendor performance monitoring and scorecards, it's important to learn how to design and use these tools effectively. Understanding the key differences between a target and a goal, knowing if a measure is subjective or objective, can really make all the difference in effective performance management. It's also advantageous to know when and how you should use a service level agreement versus a key performance indicator. Keep in mind that how you and your organization manage vendor performance is completely up to you. You determine the metrics, data capture, reporting, and issue management for your organization. Some of the concepts I'm sharing today may or may not work for you, but that's okay. You can cherry pick what techniques work for you and incorporate into your routines. Turning to how to manage vendor performance, make sure to clearly define and document expectations using those service level agreements, which define the expected level of service, and they represent the most essential and non-negotiable requirements for the product or service. They're formalized in a contract. Examples are like regulatory compliance, breach notification, or system uptime. Note that depending on the situation, the vendor may have financial penalties, or such as contract termination, if the vendor fails to meet the SLAs. However, alternatively, a vendor may receive a bonus or other benefit for exceeding the SLAs for some products and services. Key performance indicators also measure performance. Vendors and clients set these metrics to gauge how well the vendor is doing and if they're meeting expectations. KPIs often measure different levels of performance, such as customer satisfaction, quality, errors or rework, inventory management, or efficiency. KPIs are often used to confirm that SLAs are being met. Establish a formal performance management routine. Performance management must be proactive and it must be a consistent activity. The higher the risk of the relationship, the more frequently you will need to review performance. The performance of critical and high-risk vendors need to be reviewed more often, as they can decline and can have serious implications for your organization. See the recommended cadences listed below. And note, when a vendor performs poorly, best practice suggests observing and formally reviewing performance more frequently until the issues are resolved. And note that communication is key to ensuring a mutually beneficial relationship between you and your vendor. Metrics are either objective or subjective. Both can be used when evaluating vendor performance. However, we should ensure that objective or quantitative metrics account for the majority of the metrics. Let's learn more about them to understand why. Diving into objective or quantitative metrics, these are metrics that are definitive. They are usually dealing with quantities or volumes, capacity, time, percentages, costs, or number of defects. When measuring performance, objective or quantitative metrics should account for most of your metrics, and the reason why is because you get consistent and comparable measurements that allow you to see performance over time or context. Now, I'm going to give you an example here. If I were to have a commissioned painting of my beloved family, one like the Rose family of Moira, Johnny, Alexis, and David, before their family's financial collapse, the ones that adorned one of their mansion walls that were very expansive, super serious, were based in oil painting, and was going to have a massive size to fill a massive wall, and that would be adorning my home, I would provide the artist what time and day that I needed to have it done by for a birthday party, the dimensions of the frame, dimensions of the painting itself, the paint to be used, and the air in which I wanted it to be painted as a serious family based in oil painting, something that we pass down to generation, and something that would portray us like real life. Now, those are very specific, measured details, also known as objective or quantitative details. Now let's change the scenario. What happens if I just tell the artist to make me an impressive, large family portrait? With these two adjectives alone, subjectivity and qualitative metrics have entered the mix. Impressive is a very ambiguous term, and large, well, you'd be left wondering, large in size or making my family appear larger than life. What kind of medium? You know, would I be using oil, or would I be asking this artist to paint in watercolor, make it realistic or abstract? And how would my family even be captured? Would it be pointillism or layered paper? Let's continue with our family portrait examples as we move through the presentation, but you can see the stark contrast between very specific or quantitative metrics versus very ambiguous, very fluid, very subjective metrics, which don't provide a lot of information, which leaves a tremendous amount of room for interpretation. Subjective or qualitative metrics are based on personal opinion, senses, and someone's personal taste, which vary, of course, from person to person. Now, back to our family portrait example. When I've only provided subjective metrics to an artist who I've commissioned for this family portrait, and I've only provided to him that I wanted this painting to be both impressive and large, you can see how that artist would have much room for interpretation of those words, and how a customer like myself might be dissatisfied when just those subjective metrics fail to achieve the expectation I have in my mind. In contrast, subjective metrics bolstered by objective metrics would help to clear up ambiguity. This type of situation, where there's a lot of ambiguity, leaves it where the performance is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It makes performance very difficult to gauge. We definitely do not want that for our performance metrics. The artist would feel like he has delivered according to my instruction, whereas I feel like he completely missed the mark. So the moral of the story is make sure to either provide objective metrics or subjective metrics supplemented by objective metrics when you're gauging vendor performance. It will make your life easier for performance tracking purposes. Now let's talk about two specific types of metrics, SLAs and KPIs.
The next question is, does your organization have an internal legal or sourcing department for amending contracts to include things such as SLAs? Yes, no, we have an outside counsel, or you're not sure. Jill, we have another question here from the audience that we can answer. And this question is, does our organization have to have SLAs for all vendor contracts or just critical and high risk?
Thank you, Jessie. That's a great question. As we know that SLAs stand for service level agreements, and it's a tool to monitor performance and make sure that you as the client are getting what you want from your vendors who you're interacting with. It consists of metrics, responsibilities, expectations, and timing and frequency. For best practices, I absolutely recommend getting SLAs for all of your vendors. It enables you to track the metrics and ensure the responsibilities are met. Make sure that expectations on both sides are also being satisfied, and all of the work is being done in a timely fashion. So yes, I would highly recommend that to the best of your ability, all of your vendor contracts contain service level agreements or SLAs. They clearly outline expectations, they set remedies with penalty targets, and they create a culture of high quality service, and that's what we want.
Thanks, Jill. We've got about 20 seconds left on this open poll question, so please submit those answers quickly. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. We will be closing in just about 5 seconds. Thank you. On your screen now, you will see the poll results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our Understanding Vendor Performance Metrics and Scorecards ebook and scorecard template in the Related Content widget, which are available for download. Jill, back to you.
Let's turn to the topic of service level agreements, also known as SLAs. While some people use the term SLA and KPI interchangeably, they're not the same thing. SLAs are documented performance agreements which represent the must-haves for an engagement. Think of SLAs as like deal breakers and non-negotiables. Because SLAs represent the most crucial expectations, there is usually some sort of agreed upon penalty if they aren't met. In many cases, this will probably be a rebate or a discount or some other financial remedy, but there may be other treatments as determined by the organization and the vendor. A good rule of thumb regarding SLAs, they should be developed with the vendor during the contract negotiating stage. Note, the term service level agreement is reserved for those requirements that are stated in a contract. An SLA should define overall SLA objectives, state how an external provider will improve performance, save costs, or provide access to skills and or technologies that can't be provided in-house. By doing so, the customer can define the levels of service required to meet these goals, leaving the vendor no questions related to what matters and why. Now, make sure to create with the vendor, meaning that both parties to the contract must agree on them. If you create unachievable or unrealistic SLAs unilaterally, then you can expect the vendor will either not agree to them, or you can anticipate that a naive vendor will agree to them and fail to meet them because they're unrealistic. The best practice is to develop SLAs which are both created and negotiated by both parties to a contract. Each individual product or service should be defined, including a description of the service, where it is to be provided, to whom it is to be provided, and when it is required. Specificity helps. Here we go to identify performance standards. Okay, specific KPIs and measurements that will substantiate performance must be identified, agreed upon, and memorialized in the SLA. Identify compensation service credits. Any penalties for poor performance or incentives for exceptional performance must be agreed upon and notated in the SLA. Make sure to define critical failure. Define what constitutes a critical failure for this particular contract. A critical failure provides grounds for termination of a contract. The best practice, effective SLAs define critical failure for that particular contract, stating such in the contract enables termination based on this occurrence taking place. Now we come to another widely used type of metric known as the KPI, or the Key Performance Indicator. Such metrics are generally used to measure performance and indicate trends. Similar to SLAs, they should be used to measure the most important aspects of performance. KPIs are also used to help substantiate specific SLAs, but they are not necessarily detailed in the contract, and you don't have specific penalties. KPIs can give you a lot of valuable information, especially when it comes to spotting problems and potential root causes. You don't have to have a ton of KPIs to measure different aspects of vendors' performance in terms of quality, service, timeliness, customer satisfaction, costs, and defects. Let's talk about data and reporting for a minute, because these two elements are really the foundation of any performance evaluation. In many cases, your vendor will be providing data to substantiate their performance. That's fine. However, when you are reliant on a data source, you need to occasionally test that data for accuracy. Personally, I experienced one situation where performance data depicted one story, but internal operational data illustrated a completely different story. Let's just say at the root of the discrepancy was a misplaced decimal, which caused a variance that yielded crazy results. But the conflict required that we dissect all the data to locate the issue, and if the team had thought about testing the data before there was a glaring error, then the situation would not have occurred. Moral of the story, test your data periodically to make sure everything is accurate along the way. Validation will ensure that you are measuring the right factors and enable you to identify an error earlier than later. Another important consideration is how often you should pull and review data of vendors' performance. Best practice is to look at the service cycle or transaction length and set accordingly. Let's use this example. Suppose a lockbox service center posts 20,000 checks per week or 80,000 checks per month. Each one of these posts is going to contribute to the vendor's performance and probably your NPS rating, also known as a customer satisfaction score. Each one of these posts provides the opportunity for something to go well or poorly, and in some cases, if it goes poorly, it can go snowballing very, very quickly. Regarding this lockbox scenario, data should be tracked frequently because if trouble isn't spotted early, we know that there are 80,000 opportunities for something to go wrong during the month. If data is checked even further out, for instance, until the end of a quarter, now we're talking about that 80,000 opportunities per month times 3, or 240,000 opportunities that are based on, for instance, say a miscalculation in the data, and that could translate into 240,000 unhappy customers. Probably not the best plan. So consider that service cycle or transaction frequency when you're deciding how often to review the vendor's data supporting performance. Now, regarding formalizing performance reviews, which is a necessary routine, make sure to entail a documented meeting with your vendor to discuss performance. This should be performed at least quarterly for your critical and high-risk vendors. For your moderate vendors, depending on the product or service, this should be done maybe once or twice a year. Now, note, make sure not to wait before your vendor performance review to look at how your vendor is performing. The entire point of ongoing monitoring is to have this occur constantly. The best way to avoid unpleasant surprises is to pay attention and be plugged in to what's going on all the time. All right, now let's discuss scorecards. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to speak to those of you who are new to vendor scorecards or who are implementing scorecards for the first time. There are just as many ways to assemble a scorecard as there are vendors. There are countless templates, services, and software offerings out there. But I'm going to start with a very basic and simple way to assemble one, which is a good scorecard has essential data on a single page. You can opt to present supporting data along with that scorecard, but don't expect most folks to look beyond the first page. You may be asking yourself why. It's because a lot of organizations have anywhere from 15 to 30 critical vendors, so what you include must be concise and easy visually. So err on the side of brevity. The elements I recommend to include in your scorecards are listed below. There are 9. Here's a scorecard example for your reference. Continuing with our scorecard example, there are some performance issues and a missed SLA in the previous slide. Note that the missed SLA in our example you'll need to determine whether the penalties apply. So if you see that top left box is where the missed SLA occurs. You should also document what the expected remedy will look like and when the remedy will take place. Regarding the scorecard in the example, see the very high-level description for remediation plans. It's in the top right corner. The summary does not preclude you from retaining a detailed, documented remediation plan agreement between your organization and your vendor. In the example, both the missed SLA occurrence in the scorecard and the detailed remediation plan should be retained in the vendor record. Here are a number of key takeaways. Articulate how the vendor is supporting your organizational goals. Use SLAs in your contract document and enforce the most important or non-negotiable requirements. Balance objective and subjective performance measures. Track KPIs over time to identify trends. Test performance data periodically. Consider service cycle or transaction length when determining how often to review performance data. Always document and track vendor performance issues. Require documented remediation plans and monitor them. And remember, keep scorecards simple. Thank you all for your time and attention. I'll pass this back to Jesse for the remainder of the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill, for that informative session. Now I would like to pass it back over to Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, to wrap up our 3-day bootcamp with a discussion around program metrics and reporting in third-party risk management. Monitoring metrics occur in the ongoing stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle, but reporting occurs throughout the entire lifecycle as part of governance. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, everyone, as we are heading towards the last couple sessions of our program today, we are going to be talking about third-party risk management reporting and program metrics. And since we've got a lot to cover in a short time, we're just going to jump right in. Now, as you've probably noticed, one of the foundational components of the third-party risk management lifecycle is that documentation and reporting. And reporting is a very essential component of having an effective program. So why do we need reporting? Well, first of all, we need to inform our management and the board of relevant issues, what's going on with our critical vendors, how the program is performing, and we need to confirm that the necessary risk management activities are taking place on time. We also need to manage and track all of our vendor issues and evaluate how much capacity we have to complete these activities. We also need to retain all this information to provide evidence of that program effectiveness and compliance for auditors and examiners. We also need to provide information to our stakeholders so they can drive action. Now, if you're new to third-party risk management reporting, let's talk about a few of the essential reports that you must have. So the first one is your third-party inventory. Keep in mind that newly released guidance from the OCC, FDIC, and Fed all require that all of your third-party relationships are captured in an inventory. We want to make sure that inventory clearly identifies the products and services they provide, their risk rating, if they're critical or non-critical, if there's any essential fourth or nth parties. We want to categorize by risk rating and by product type. We also need a separate report that clearly identifies our critical third parties with that same information, including that third party owner, any open issues, and any contract or renewal dates. A really good report to keep is that PII detail list. So any third party that is accessing, processing, transmitting, or storing PII, we want to know exactly which components of PII they have. In the event of a breach or some other data issue, we can quickly locate what is at risk. We should be keeping a risk assessment or reassessment and due diligence list that shows where every vendor and vendor engagement is in the process, keeping track of any that are at risk or past due, which SMEs are assigned, when those reviews are due, and next steps in ownership. And then finally, a really important report is your issue management report. We want to keep track of any open issues, where they are in remediation, who owns them, next steps, etc. We also want a full report of our third-party contracts with that contract number or identifier, when they're up for renewal, and if there's any associated scope of work or amendments. We need a complete list of the third-party due diligence documentation we have on file by that third party, and preferably by engagement. That means that we actually can locate the vendor documents provided to us, including SOC reports, insurance certificates, licenses, etc. We also want to keep a report about third-party performance. So we need to know that people are meeting their SLAs, their KPIs, or KRIs. We want the current performance and the trending for the last 12 to 18 months, and we need any performance issues and mitigation summaries. So let's take a look at 3 common stakeholder groups and what they might be expecting regarding reporting. First, we have our risk committee. We should be providing a regular view of program compliance. We should really be focusing on new and emerging risk, any vendor issues, and any items requiring action. Once an issue is identified, we need to make sure that we have a treatment plan for it, and the best way to do that is to present the issues needing action to the committee first. That way the right people can get involved and help remediate them before that issue shows up on a senior leadership or board report. When it comes to senior leadership, they are ultimately accountable for the health, stability, and effectiveness of the third-party risk management program, and they need the information to make decisions accordingly. So reporting to senior leadership should always highlight items that need their approval or influence, and include a standard set of metrics, including targets and trends, that are going to help validate the program's health. Lastly, we have the board of directors, and the board of directors is accountable for third-party risk management oversight. So the data we provide to the board should enable them to assess if the program is effective and working as intended. Reporting to this group of stakeholders should always include a high-level view of the program size, risk exposure, compliance, and any material risk issues that require their attention. What you report and how often you report is important. So in most cases, you're going to be reporting monthly, quarterly, and annually. We want to make sure that we're always reporting the right information at the right time. So on a monthly basis, this may be for your direct management or vendor risk committee or even the lines of business. Due to the frequency of this report, you need to focus on what stakeholders need to know or do now. This reporting should also include what's coming up for the next 30 days regarding deliverables, communications, audits, etc. And you may want to provide status reports of issue remediation as well. When we get to quarterly, this might be for a general risk committee or similar governing body. We want to use our reporting not only to provide a picture of the program in general, but also to drive specific issues to conclusion. We need to highlight anything that needs action or intervention. And this reporting should also provide the foundation for short-term planning. On an annual basis, the information provided in the yearly report should be more comprehensive. Remember, the board and senior leadership needs enough information to ensure the program is on track and effective. We need to show them how we stack up against our program metrics, if we have strong internal compliance, the results of any audit or exam, and if there's any regulatory changes. It's also a great time to highlight any noteworthy program successes or challenges and the plan for the next 1 to 2 years. As a recommendation, if you can influence the timing of this report, it should be a companion presentation to the board as part of the annual policy review or update. Now, we've already alluded to the many reasons why we should be reporting, but why should we measure the specific health of our program in particular? Well, first of all, these metrics are designed to help the senior management and the board understand the health and stability of the program. It helps them drive actions or decisions, and it can show any program gaps or weaknesses. It's a great way to show vendor risk across the portfolio, and if necessary, this data can support any request for additional resources. We also want to illustrate any successes or challenges of third-party risk management at a program level. Keep in mind, of course, we want to measure the activities in the third-party risk management lifecycle, but there are other metrics that we need to pay attention to, such as internal compliance, any exam or audit findings, our process efficiency, how many resources we have, and more. Now, if you're new to developing these metrics for your program, we have a pretty simple 10-step process that we're going to go through in detail. But first of all, we want to identify our corporate goals and objectives. We need to prioritize them and select the top 3 to 5. For each objective, we're going to identify life cycle activities, program requirements, or other components to measure. Then we're going to prioritize those components and select the top 3 to 5. We also need to test our data and calculations, set thresholds, review with our stakeholders, and revise them if necessary. So let's take a deeper look at each of those steps. So first of all, we want to consider all the reasons that we have third-party risk management as an organization. So what are the primary drivers for the program? For some, it might be regulatory compliance or making sure governance and oversight is happening. Some organizations are really about third-party performance and value, driving investor confidence, etc. We want to list as many as we can think of because we're going to prioritize them to develop where we want to focus our reporting. In this example, we've picked the top 5. So regulatory compliance, mitigating that third-party risk. We want to make sure we're having good performance and value from our vendors. Cybersecurity protection is a big one, and we want to make sure that we have good business continuity and disaster recovery. Now that we've identified those goals and objectives, it's time to start identifying possible metrics for each area. So for example, for compliance, we might want to look at critical vendors with current risk reviews or anything that's out of compliance with the third-party program. We might want to review customer complaints and any internal program compliance failures. For vendor risk mitigation, we might want to look at what the inherent risk versus residual risk for critical and high vendors is, how many business interrupting events we've had, maybe how many single point of failure vendors we have where there's only one vendor who's able to provide the service. We might also want to look at past due vendor issues. And for vendor performance and value, maybe we want to look at vendors meeting or exceeding their SLAs, how many critical and high-risk vendors have regular performance reviews, and the line of business adherence to that vendor performance review schedule. When it comes to identifying those potential metrics, there's all kinds of places we can look for ideas. So we can start with any activities in the vendor or third-party risk management lifecycle. We can think about metrics that would support program operations or governance or even risk management. Now, when we think about our metrics, we have to have data. So where might we find our data? Well, hopefully we'd find a lot of it in our third-party risk management system, but we could also look in our accounts payable, any issue management and tracking systems. Maybe our info security has tools and reporting we could use, contract management systems, customer complaint logs, stakeholder satisfaction surveys, any audit or exam reports, and any benchmarking surveys or reports are also a good place to look and get ideas. So very quickly, let's review some potential operational metrics. We might want to look at the percentage of engagements that are risk rated or the percentage of issues remediated within the specific time frame. We might want to look at the ratio of third-party vendor employees against how many vendors we have that are moderate and above. Maybe we want to look at the number of process exceptions we're making or the percentage of vendors returning due diligence on time. We can also look at the number of vendors by risk rating. For compliance, we might consider the percentage of engagements that comply with the policy, or how many engagements have current risk reassessments. We might look at the number of vendor compliance incidents, or internal business unit compliance, or even the number of audit or exam findings. So when it comes to our risk metrics, a couple examples might be the percentage of issues not remediated on time, how many engagements have past due risk assessments, how many single point of failure vendors do we have. We also might want to look at risk in terms of how our internal business units are complying with the specific requirements that we've laid out, or even how many third-party risk management employees we have compared to the number of vendors we have rated moderate and above. So as we're thinking about metrics, it's also important to think about a mix of metrics, meaning that we should have both KPIs and KRIs. Now, if you're just starting off, we do want to have some KPIs that would show the program's working as it should. But over time, metrics are most valuable when they can help us actually predict and manage risk. So remember, KPIs confirm the program has performed as expected. Remember, that's a lagging indicator. And KRIs are giving us data to prevent risk from occurring or from becoming worse. So they're a leading indicator. So a little trick or a hack I like to use is to identify metrics and think about a KPI and an associated KRI for each metric. So that can increase how valuable the reporting is overall. So let's look at an example. So if the metric is percentage of engagements that are risk rated, from a performance rationale, we are demonstrating operational effectiveness, compliance with our policy, and internal compliance. But from a risk perspective, we know that the higher the percentage of engagements that are not risk rated, that means we have a higher likelihood for business interrupting events, exam or audit findings, reputational damage, or financial loss. Now, of course, every metric needs to have defined boundaries. We need a threshold, because if the metric is beyond that threshold, then we have to take some action. So as you're developing your metrics, make sure you identify those targets or those thresholds. These are just some examples. Of course, your organization has to pick the right limits and thresholds that are reflective of your risk appetite and that are also manageable. All right, as you start finalizing your metrics, make sure you test the data sources and calculations. We want everything to be correct. And review the story we're trying to tell. Are these the right metrics? Are they measuring the right dimension? You know, keep in mind, one of the big problems we see is that sometimes data is too hard to collect or interpret, or too many data points are required for a single metric. Once you have that all together, review these proposed metrics with your key stakeholders in management, have a discussion, get some feedback. You may need to revise them a little bit, but keep in mind we are looking for the best set of metrics, so that feedback's really important. So you probably have a variety of reports that you're already doing for your program, but let's think about how those reports or some of the recommended reports can help validate your metrics and your operational effectiveness. So first of all, that third-party inventory report, there's a lot of information on there, everything from risk rating to number of vendors by risk category. Your risk assessments report, so how current are we on these risk assessments? Who is past due? Did anybody not pass the risk assessment? What kind of remediations are in progress? We want to report about program compliance, so we do want to track that the lines of business are complying with the policy and the processes. We want to capture if we're making exceptions and why, how many times we've had to escalate an issue, etc. All right, of course, your third party's issues list is going to be a great resource for your metrics, but you might also want to consider new or emerging risks to help you really understand maybe something that wasn't captured in the last risk assessment, changes in the industry, et cetera. We also want to keep track of regulatory considerations, anything that has recently changed, any proposed regulations, and how that might impact your program overall. And then, of course, it's really great to have a report that shows your reporting timeline, what kind of information you make available to your stakeholders, to the lines of business, to management and the board. This is great evidence of both oversight and governance as well as operational effectiveness. And while you think about that, time for another poll. Jessie?
We are to our last poll question of the day, and that is, our third-party risk management program establish performance metrics that are monitored and reported? Yes, it's in development, no, or you're not sure. Hillary, I have another question here that is coming from the audience.
All right.
Great. Our vendor risk software has automatic reporting available. Do we actually have to distribute that reporting, or is it okay to just inform stakeholders that it is there?
Well, when it comes to your board and your senior management, you should have a formal reporting distribution schedule and cadence. So, for example, every month, your board members or your senior management gets a report that, for example, details any open issues with critical vendors. For the rest of your stakeholders, while letting them know it's there is an option, it's not always optimal. I like to suggest creating either a monthly email or newsletter or link to reporting that's relevant for those stakeholders, just reminding them to go out there and take a look at it. Because one of the main reasons that we practice all this reporting is to make sure that our stakeholders are informed and can make good decisions based on that information. So I would try and be more proactive about distributing it, but keep in mind that for your board and senior management, you must distribute regular reporting. I hope that helps.
And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. Before we move on, in the related content widget, we have our 6 third-party risk management reports to maintain infographic. This resource discusses 6 reports and each report's data to include the purpose and getting started. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
Now that you've kind of figured out your metrics, you're going to want to put it all together for your stakeholders. And how you do that is completely up to you and your organization. You could use a scorecard format or a spreadsheet format. Totally up to you. Use charts and graphs if desired. Put it in a spreadsheet. Use color coding to really help the viewer understand where metrics might be close or beyond the acceptable thresholds. And if you have a team that puts together reporting, governance or risk reporting already, go ahead and check in with them. They probably have a lot of great ideas about how to visually represent and present that data. Now, I know we've talked about a lot, but here's just some important things to keep in mind. Keep those initial metrics really limited, because as the process moves along, you're naturally going to develop new metrics or change existing metrics. So don't over-engineer it from the beginning. And don't get stuck in analysis paralysis. Sometimes it's obvious what we should be measuring, and sometimes that evolves over time. It's all right to know that the first pass is probably not going to be perfect, but it's a good place to get started. Talk to your other internal risk domains. They may be doing similar reporting or have experience to share. And above all, stay open to that feedback, because we want to have the best program metrics and the best presentation of those metrics possible. So to wrap up this session, here's some key takeaways. First of all, we know that reporting and documentation are essential for third-party risk management. After all, we want to make sure that our stakeholders are informed with the right data so that they can make good decisions. So making sure they have that information and they have it at the right time is really important. We also want to make sure that we're measuring the health and effectiveness of our program overall, and that our metrics for doing that really reflect our organizational objectives for third-party risk management. It's a really good practice to include both KPIs and KRIs in those metrics. And as a final thought, make sure that your metrics are telling the right story and that they're helping you manage risk. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie. Jessie?
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our third and final day of boot camp. We appreciate your participation, engagement, and questions. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Hillary, Raman, and Jill, for their time in sharing really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On October 3rd, our differences between vendor SOC reports, and on October 5th, our Your Vendors SOC Report, What and How to Review webinar. We hope that you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Raman, this next question will come to you. If a private vendor does not provide financial information, what can we do to perform due diligence?
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you for the question, folks. Appreciate you all listening into our bootcamp session today. As I discussed earlier in the presentation, when I was going through the slides, private vendor oftentimes will not cooperate or may not even have the information necessary for you all to do your typical financial due diligence. So you could request something like a financial letter directly from the CFO or an executive team member that has insight into the financial position of the company. And the financial letter should focus on things like the revenue, the profitability, the cash, and the availability to for capital so that they can support their contracts and their operations and thereby not have issues with supporting customers like yourself. They can't produce a financial letter. You can always rely on a public data source or a credit report like an Argos or a Dun & Bradstreet report to get some semblance of the credit profile and the size of the business, thereby also removing the need to interact with the vendor or get cooperation from the vendor. So you have some options, and we talked a little bit about all the different ones, but those are two key ones you can utilize. Back over to you, Jessie.
Thanks, Raman. Jill, we will hop over to you for this next question. And that question is, could you please explain the difference between quantitative and qualitative work?
Sure thing, Jessie. Thank you so much for the question. The difference between the two is part of it's very intuitive. Quantitative, like the word quantity, it is a limited metric, it's definitive, it's measurable. And whereas qualitative, on the other hand, think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Qualitative metrics like quality, it varies from person to person, it's very subjective, and it's fluid based on personal taste. Back to the Rose family example that I gave during the presentation with the commission of a family portrait that I was asking for, quantitative metrics include the time when the painting must be ready for pickup, the painting's canvas's dimensions, the paint type, which was oil, and the manner was specified as formal and lifelike and taken from a photograph, whereas qualitative, on the other hand, which is based in quality and personal taste, that's subjective. And I had asked the artist for the commission painting to be impressive and large, and clearly that leaves a lot of room for misinterpretation and personal opinion, because what does actually impressive mean and to whom, and what does large exactly mean? So that's the basic difference between the two. Qualitative metrics offer loads of ambiguity, and I hope this helps to illuminate the understanding.
Thank you, Jill. Hillary, we'll come over to you for this next question.
All right.
Does every type of third party have to follow the life cycle?
So here's what's important to remember. If you are dealing with specific regulations that provide guidelines about what's in and what's out, then yes, you should follow those. In general, every type of third party should follow the life cycle, meaning that there should be planning for that relationship. We should understand the risks inherent in that relationship, and we should do some amount of vetting or due diligence. But keep in mind, all of those activities always have to be, one, reflective of the risk that's in that engagement, right? So what are the risks that we're bringing, and are we managing them appropriately? And then the second thing to remember is that your organization gets to determine what those appropriate measures are. Now, of course, there's best practices and guidelines, but yes, I do think every third party should have adherence to that life cycle, but what those individual activities look like can vary based on the risk type, the amount, and what your organization wants to do with it. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Raman, we'll come over to you for this last question. How should we define criticality to determine what type of financial due diligence we should perform on a vendor relationship?
Thanks, Jesse. And I saw a couple of you folks during the presentation or after it asking some of these questions, and it's a good one. From criticality, I think it goes beyond just financial health assessments. You want to do an assessment as part of your third-party risk management program as to really the simplest form of defining criticality is the notion of if this vendor were to get hacked or if it were to be disrupted, would it have significant or material impacts on your overall business and operations? So to give you an example, if you're a technology company and you utilize hosting from, say, a cloud-based source like Amazon Web Services or Azure via Microsoft, that would be a critical vendor for you, because if you do not have sustained operations from those vendors, you ultimately would have issues downstream to your clients and your services that you provide. So thinking about it as simple as that can get you started on your criticality assessment, but depending on the different factors of whether or not they have specific information or private information about your customers or your data is also another factor that typically factors into how to define a critical vendor and how to basically put them at the top of your list for a lot of your third-party risk due diligence, specifically financial health. So get started with something as simple as, do they disrupt my operations if they were to have issues, and do they have information that's sensitive or very confidential? And then from there you can add other qualities like how much you spend on that vendor as another supporting artifact or document in your risk assessment and your criticality assessments before you do your due diligence. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Raman. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, Raman, and Jill, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank all of our presenters over the last 3 days, and thank you all for attending, and hope you found the bootcamp valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including vendor performance management, financials, and reporting. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record each day of the bootcamp, and those recording links will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. Once again, thank you to all of our experts for another great bootcamp, and thank you again for everyone in the audience for taking the time to join us around our virtual campfire and listen in. If you've submitted a question but it wasn't answered live, don't worry, we will follow up via email. On behalf of VenMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.